pressurized the government to maintain the country's Nordic character of nationhood. They responded with a quota system for Eastern European settlers. The Jewish Quota Act of 1930 was followed by the 1937 Anti-Aliens Act, which barred the influx of Jewish people at the same time when the eugenics movement was sweeping the world. The biggest number of Polish Jews came to South Africa during the gold and diamond rush. Polish settlers, also known as Poles of Jewish origin, Poles of Judaic faith, Lithuanians, Jews, and even Russian Jews were settled. Between 1880 and 1914, the Jewish community grew from 4,000 to 40,000. Many settled in Oudtshoorn, where they renamed the area Little Jerusalem after savage ethnic cleansing, driving indigenous ostrich into near extinction and driving the Ataqua into famine and genocide. In 1925, Polish Jews made up 65% of immigration to South Africa. In February 1930, the settler parliament passed more legislation, making it difficult for Jewish people to settle here. This was called the Act Against Jews and did not apply to Commonwealth and Western European country Jews. While Jewish community was happy to oppress and commit genocide against the Ataqua people, they protested Malan's government as anti-national and anti-South Africa. By 1936, during the Depression, the Jewish community was doing well. Most of the community was involved in insurance, financial and commercial ventures. D.F. Malan started a campaign of persecution. He's quoted by the Burger newspaper as saying, "There is a section of the Jews seeking revenge on the National Party for the Quotas Act, but they are, of course, afraid to come out in the open." Nazi pamphlets were soon openly circulated in Johannesburg right-wing circles as Jews were blamed for the increase in poor white Boer settlers. By May 1936, the arrival of Eastern European settlers was reduced to 50 per year. Eastern European and socialist cultures restricted their population from enforcing transfers of large amounts of Jews to the colonies. Dr. Malan outlined the three principles of his anti-Jewish act. 1. The desire for every nation to maintain its basic composition. Number 2, the doctrine of assimilation. And number 3, South Africa's desire to maintain its own type of civilization and the fact that the civilizations of Eastern and Southern Europe was to a large extent different from that of Western Europe. Between 1993 and 1936, with Hitler's rise to power, approximately 3,615 German Jews entered South Africa. A very large number of previously arrived invaders and settlers were descendants of Germany, making their support for Nazi Germany very expected and predictable. They were already part of the Boer community. Jan Smuts extended the quota system to include a provision that only Jewish passport holders from European countries may enter during this time. They should all have £100 on arrival. By 1937, there were 90,000 Jewish people in South Africa. During the 19th and 20th century, most Germans traveled to South Africa from Hamburg via Southampton or London. Germans and Scandinavians were not allowed to practice their faith at all. When when in 1790 the policy changed around religion, there was a huge influx of Germans, and they established their churches. They too were given thousands of acres of land. In March 1843, 35 peasant families arrived in Natal from Osnabrück, Bremen, and called their new home New Deutschland. The Baumwolldeutschen, or the cotton Germans as they were called, arrived in the Natal in 1848. These 187 German settler families came to work on a cotton venture that failed. They decided to stay after their entry into Ethiopia was refused. The Hermannsburg Mission Society had their entries into Germany, into Zanzibar, Mombasa blocked and made their main focus South Africa. They settled in places like Pietermaritzburg, Vryheid, Dundee, and around the south coast. Free land as usual. The mass displacement of 1857 saw the arrival of thousands of Germans in areas including the Eastern Cape, Clanwilliams, Hanover, and King Williamstown. On the behest of Queen Victoria, a large group of mercenaries called the British German Legion, who fought in the Crimean War, were recruited and sent to East London, South Africa. They arrived with their families in 1857, of course, receiving free land as long as they could clear it violently and whatever means from native peoples. These settlers were completely illiterate and unskilled. There are reports that some of them became so hungry and were starving to the extent that they started eating their pets, specifically their dogs. During the Boer Wars of 1899 to 1903, Germans supported the Boers wholeheartedly. Scores of Scandinavians arrived during the Reign of Terror by the year 17. A group of 246 Norwegian settlers arrived on 29 August 1882 at Marburg, Port Shepstone. By 1889, there were between 4,000 and 5,000 people from Nordic countries in South Africa, coming from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Swedish migration to South Africa peaked between 1890 and 1990. At that time, there was conflict between the British and the Boer. The Scandinavian Corps, with an ambulance service of 113 men and 4 women, were dispatched to help the Boers. The Trichards and the Stockenstroms were from that group, and they are still very visible today with all of their wealth gloating in the face of natives. The Ossewa Brandwacht was established in 1939 in Bloemfontein. The Ossewa Brandwacht was an anti-British, pro-German group that promoted racial purity. At this time, the settler government started sending young so-called intellectuals to Germany to study Nazi ideology. Hendrik Verwoerd was one of them, and upon his return was instrumental in developing Nazi-type policies for South Africa, which became implemented when apartheid was established in 1948. The Nazi philosophy absolutely did not escape South Africans on the ground. The Boere established the shirt movement. The grey shirts of the early 1960s with its orange flag and its blue motifs were consistent with the colors of the Nazi swastika and their ideology. The Provisional Intergovernmental Committee for the Movement of Migrants from Europe, the PICMME, replaced the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, when 173 member states formed this organization after the Second World War. Intergovernmental Committee for European Migration, the ICEM, was formed in 1956 and recruited 10,500 poor Europeans to immigrate to South Africa. It was a coalition financed by 29 member countries to actively relocate people from England, Holland, France, Belgium, and Scandinavia. It took care of settlers' every need, including free enslaved people and land. Immigration requirements were very lax, and immigration officers and translators were more like performance actors and mascots. With such a great deal, the poor and the working class from Europe were excited to come to South Africa, resulting in a steady flow of Europeans into the country. Usually the men would come first and then arrange free passage and all available freebies for the rest of the family and extended family. Before 1914, the flow of immigrants were funded by member countries. The factors dominating migration was apparently supply and demand. It is not clear what they were supplying, and it's not clear who was demanding them to come here. Certainly not indigenous people. The Department of Immigration was formed in 1962, funded to the tune of 640,000 Rand to pay for immigration journeys for poor Europeans to South Africa. Immigrants to South Africa would receive 120 Rand, which was the equivalent at the time of 65 pounds sterling, each settler, and including children, and their voyage and resettlement was covered by the South African apartheid government. Those without prearranged employment would be put up in hotels at the state's expense, served hand and foot by the natives. There were no custom duties for them, whether they were taking people or whether they were taking animals, minerals, resources, everything was free. During the end of December of 1930, 1,000 settlers arrived in Cape Town. At the end of that year, 3 more boats carrying many hundreds of settlers were arriving and welcomed into our country. Between 1849 and 1851, more than 20 ships carrying the English, Scottish, and Irish arrived in Natal. The Cape took thousands of these people, and those who preferred the interior were given large farms in places they chose. During 1859, 2,588 settlers, mostly country masons, domestic servants, blacksmiths, slaves, and joiners arrived from Europe. The first 288 arrived in August, more arrived in September, and in May 1861, 283 unskilled laborers arrived with their families. From 1946 to 1970, 618 white European settlers arrived on our land. They included 238,000 from Britain, 260,000 from Europe, mainly from Holland, and the occupied land of Israel. 120,000 went to other British colonies, including India, Kenya, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. Most of the Swiss men at the Cape were servants of the Here 17 who brought their freedom and became free burghers. The names Laubsche, De La Harpe, Mathieu, and Foster is still visible in extreme wealth in South Africa. The Swiss names also underwent widespread name changes. An estimated 16,000 men served in the Swiss regiment of the year 17 in overseas territories from 1693 to 1795. Jan Oberholzer from Zurich was a commander of the Stellenbosch and Drakenstein Dragoons. He later appropriated tens of thousands of acres of land near Klapmuts. Only 4 Swiss settlers applied for land in Klapmuts in 1681. 1 applied in Stellenbosch in 1686, 1 applied in Franschhoek Valley in 1691, and 1 applied in Pearly Beach in 1750. 2 other Swiss bought land in a somehow honorable way. One of them grabbed land at the mouth of the Salt River in 1673. There are dozens of pockets of Greeks scattered all over Africa. The Greeks were mainly traders taking advantage of the trade route to Central Europe. Over the centuries, most of their travels coincided with massive socio-economic problems at different periods in their history. South Africa was one of the first countries to receive Greeks who, unlike other European settlers, were relatively educated and literate. The South African Review in 1904, in its criticism of the Dutch settler, declared that putting every obstacle in the way of increasing the British proportions of the colony and flooding the land with the lowest continental, anybody who isn't British. This would be referring to the southern Mediterranean European. Many of them still came licking their wounds after the humiliating defeat in 1897 against Turkey. When they arrived, they were obligated to choose sides between the British and the Boere. They found themselves in the middle of a conflict. The Greeks fought on either side of the British and the Boere in the Anglo-Boer War, during which time there were 181 families in the country. They too came searching for a better life, having been offered £25 per month to work as miners, railway workers, small traders, farm laborers, and artisans. Bad mining conditions claimed too many lives, and those who survived started their own small businesses. There was significant influx of Greeks between 1955 and 1959. From 1974 to 1979, those fleeing the Turkish invasion of Cyprus were young, unemployed males from rural areas of Cyprus. Some of the names of these early Greek arrivals still exist. They are very, very, very visible. The Marudas, Lasopolis, Saurus, Nocalades, Costas, and Anastasis are still some of the richest Greeks in South Africa. By the mid-20th century, there were more than 45,000 Greeks living in South Africa. By 1891, there was 210 Italians in the Cape. In the early 20th century, South Africa was still recovering from the war while preparing to enter World War I and struggling to recruit Europeans. Italian immigration did increase between the First and the Second World War. The periods of 1901 to 1905, the Italian fascist periods, when migration to South Africa was encouraged, immigration declined. During the Anglo-Boer War, the Italians gave the Boers unflinching support, particularly on the Witwatersrand. This resulted in the arrival of the Italian Volunteer Corps to assist the Boere, and the Italian militia was formed. This group, called the Ricciardi Legion or the Italianische Verkennungskorps, was made up of approximately 100 South African-born Italians, native Italians, and Italians from Argentina. After this disbandment in 1900, they continued to fight alongside the Boere until their defeat in 1902. After the war, the British restricted immigration of Italians to the gold-producing areas to 8 persons per month. Their prison camp, Zonderwater Prison in Cullinan, was divided into 4 blocks, complete with theatres, sports facilities, workshops, schools, hospitals, and arts festivals were thrown. That was very posh for a prisoner of war camp. By 1943, there were close to 3,000 prisoners of war employed by the apartheid government in construction and as lorry drivers. These prisoners had day passes so they could come and go as they please. The experience in Cullinan was so positive that many prisoners of war opted to stay in South Africa after they've served their sentences instead of going back to Italy and retaining their peasant existence. From 1941, they were allowed to marry, and in 1944, these prisoners were allowed to own land. When Jan Smuts's United Party was defeated by D.F. Malan's United Party in 1948, recruitment of settlers was halted to consolidate the local Boer population. The total number of immigrants was 4,217 between 1948 and 1951, with the favorable conditions created by the government for the Italian settler and the prisoners of war during the 1950s and 60s. Big corporations like Fiat, Olivetti, and Iveco were able to open branches all over the country. By the 1990s, the Italian population in South Africa was estimated at 120,000, evenly divided between those born here and the new settler. This included 92,000 prisoners of war who were held at the Zonderwater prisoner of war camp between 1941 and 1947. Lebanese and Syrian people entered South Africa in the 19th century under British colonial rule that classified people according to color. The Lebanese were not allowed to own land. They challenged the law in 1913 when a Syrian Lebanese argued that Syrians were from the birthplace of Christ and that the law was anti-Christian. After the introduction of the Population Registration Act in 1948, the Lebanese faced losing their white elite status, and they were mortified. The Lebanese no longer were welcome, as the skin tone was difficult to uniformly classify. Despite all these privileges and luxuries presented to the European, a poor white problem developed amongst what they now call themselves the Boere. The first time the term poor white was used was at a conference in Cradock in 1916. It was at this conference that it was agreed that to be poor and white was unnatural, and there was a call for a more scientific approach to this problem. This was also when industrial segregation was implemented in order to ensure the best jobs for illiterate, unqualified, dysfunctional whites. Similar conferences were held in Stellenbosch and Bloemfontein. At one of these in 1923, General Herzog pleaded with the delegates to replace the term poor white problem with unemployment problem. strict job reservation policies were already in place, ensuring that the natives are kept out and that settlers had sheltered employment. The Carnegie Report of 1932 found that the competition between successful Africans and poor whites had a demoralizing effect on European settlers and recommended special housing and state subsidies for 250,000 poor whites. The Carnegie Report also suggested the enslavement of more native people due to Boere not having intellectual and physical capacity to work the land. It is then very surprising to now see so many poor whites in the streets, having received a 370-year head start over native Africans.